Well, I'm delighted to join you all this afternoon. It's a real treat, and what we've been doing with the energy poll is quite exciting and novel. So I can't promise I'll get as many words in as Michael did, but he's a fast talker. But I think that you'll see we're doing a really neat project here at UT. So I titled this, I gave it a bit of a Texas focus, insights from the UT Austin Energy Poll about Texas. But while I have you as an audience, I'm going to talk a little bit as well just about some of the other, some of the strengths of the poll, what we've been able to find out, what we're learning, and how it's been used. So to give you a little bit of background, the Energy Poll is an impartial and authoritative source on public perspectives on energy. So we aim to inform business development, work with folks in policy, and also be a tool for people thinking and writing about energy, especially journalists and folks in academia. We know we've had some success so far. We hear bits and pieces trickle back about where the data's been used. It's been used by the White House. It's been cited in congressional hearings. It also shows up in a large number of media publications, both in and out of industry. So we're feeling good about how useful it's been. We have the next survey just went out into the field. It'll be the completion of the 4th year. Well, let me tell you how it's set up. Every 6 months, we survey the American public on general topics such as prices and availability, energy concerns, how satisfied they are with different groups working on energy, and consumer behaviors and voting preferences. So what we're doing is working to develop a longitudinal data set over time to look at how attitudes change or whether they change. And it's nationally representative, so we have well over 2,000 respondents every 6 months, sometimes around 2,500 respondents every 6 months. So all the data is weighted to reflect US Census demographics. In each wave, we also have about 15 to 20% of the questions that we change. We call these our hot topics. I didn't coin that. It makes me feel like it's The View or something. But we focus on one specific area that is either timely or coincides with something in the news. So we've looked at everything. You can see this list starting from 2012. We looked at hydraulic fracturing. Through the 2 elections since we started, we've taken a special focus on voting behavior, so what energy topics might inspire people to get out and vote, what are their priorities. We also look at energy and water, consumer behavior, efficiency, and looking ahead, the poll that we're going to be getting back in a couple weeks has a special focus on Keystone XL and a little bit on gas prices. I'm very anxious to see what that looks like. I think that pretty much every 6 months we see people's top energy concern is the cost of gasoline, and I'm wondering how that might look after the past 6 months that we've recently experienced. So the first questionnaire was developed in 2010. The poll launched in October of 2011, and it's a UT energy poll, don't get me wrong, but it's a collaborative effort. So we work internationally with experts in energy, NGOs, folks in academia who study polling and who study energy. And I can't overemphasize the fact that this is a collaborative effort. So the 7th release, which is a lot of the data I'm going to be showing you today, was conducted early September. And at that time, we had 2,105 respondents. So, no, this is national. But what's neat is we can look specifically at Texas. So with that sample size, 5 states have populations big enough for us to look at them individually. Texas, Florida, New York, Ohio, and California. And beyond that, we can cluster things regionally by like south, northeast, northwest, depending on what we're interested in considering. But Texas is big. We got a big population down here. But just to show you the comparison, what I've done throughout this presentation is to compare US data with just Texas data. And you can see we agree on a lot of we're about at the same place in a lot of issues, and on some things like regulation, we're miles apart. So this is a look at all of our respondents. And it's just essentially how the US looks in terms of political party, age, gender. We can look at all sorts of things. We have information on race. We have information on respondents who have a smartphone. We can break things down a million different ways, and everyone talks about big data now. I mean, I am sitting on mountains and mountains and mountains of data with this energy poll. So if anyone has a lot of fun digging through numbers, I'd be happy to share some of our results. Here's a look at just the Texas respondents. It's not perfectly representative of Texas, but it's close enough to glean some interesting insights from it. And it actually doesn't look too dissimilar from the US as a whole. So we are working on developing what we're calling an engagement index. We ask questions like how interested are you in energy? How important are energy issues to you? And the first thing I learned when I started working with this poll is that to most Americans, energy is a very ambiguous term. And engagement tends to be not as high as you might expect. Energy literacy is a challenge. And when you think about it, it's not really a topic that we studied in school. Energy means a lot of different things to different people. So you're going to see throughout these slides that there's a lot of different ways people might define what we're asking. But as you can see here, the US and Texas are very close in terms of who says they're interested in energy issues. Neck and neck with those who think that energy issues are important. And Texans find energy issues a lot less exciting. I'm not exactly sure why that might be. We also ask, do you think the nation is headed in the right direction on energy issues? Texans might be slightly more optimistic, not too far beyond the margin of error, but maybe they're a little more focused. Something I didn't show, there were a lot of things that when Michael was talking in the last session, I was thinking, oh, I have a slide on that. And so there's a lot of different ways to show this. But one area that I always kind of have fun as a talking point that I didn't include as a slide, but I'll just mention, on the engagement questions, and I don't know why this is, so if you have theories, come see me after my talk. Women are so much less engaged. Women just don't tend to respond that energy issues are important or interesting or involving. They're also a lot less likely to say they're knowledgeable on energy, although I've had a lot of people say maybe, men are a little less willing to say when they don't know something. I don't know. Okay, so moving along. Who thinks gas prices are high? Most people. I mean, that's pretty much the same thing. And again, this is something we're going to be focused on very closely in the next wave. And I'll be curious to see if that dropped, because gas prices are pretty darn low right now. The last time I paid $20 to fill up my car, it was like 1997. Now, heating prices are high. I love this because, Texans probably aren't using as much heating oil as the rest of the country. So there's a little bit of difference in perspective thinking about that. We also look at voting behavior, as I said, and this is data from last fall. So the poll was released a week before the midterm election, which was great because that put us in a position to offer journalists a lot of numbers that they were interested in. And I'll share some of that in a moment. But 46% of Americans say that energy issues highly influence the way that they vote. And 47% of Texans say the same. Now, my slides moved from the order they were in, so I'm going to jump ahead a few. Okay. We talk a lot about fracking and hydraulic fracturing, different ways to say the same thing. And what is amazing to me, this came up in a question in the last session, more than half of Americans are still not even familiar with what those terms mean. Every time I feel like I turn on the radio or open the newspaper or something about fracking. So it just gives you a sense of the fact that, the kinds of things that we're focusing on here in energy might not be percolating out into the general public the way that maybe they could. Then I'll go back a couple. I just here wanted to show you a bit about the strength of what we can do with the poll. So what you see here, you can see who's familiar with the terms fracking or hydraulic fracturing. Older Americans, much more familiar with it than younger Americans. We see dramatic age differences in understanding of energy across age and also across some other factors as well. We also can consider how educated someone is. The more educated Americans are over twice as familiar with fracking as those with just a high school diploma or less. And here you have men and women. Here's an example of something I was saying before, but it gets even more dramatic on other questions. Men are almost, well, a little less than twice as familiar with hydraulic fracturing than women. I don't know why that is, but it's just something I noticed in the data. And of course, we can look by income as well. So another example, those earning $50,000 or more per household are a lot more likely to be familiar with these terms. And by party. Party's always interesting, but particularly before an election. You can see that Republicans, more than half of Republicans, say that they're familiar with the term hydraulic fracturing. But then if you look at race, there are some pretty startling differences there. African Americans are a lot less familiar with hydraulic fracturing or fracking as compared to every other group. Now, this is where you start to see the data maybe interact with other factors, because a moment ago I showed you that Democrats are a little less likely to be familiar with fracking, and we also know that Hispanics and African Americans often are more likely to be in the Democratic Party, at least in certain areas in the U.S. This is all for U.S. data. So if I'm confusing anyone, just shout out and stop me and ask me to explain something. But we see a lot of interaction between these different variables that we're considering. And then, of course, I had to do it just for Texas. Texans are a little more familiar with terms like hydraulic fracturing or fracking. Now, among those familiar with these words, we ask a subset of questions, but this isn't representative of all of Texas. This is only those who say that they know what these terms mean. Of those, more than half, 58% of Texans support hydraulic fracturing, and only 44% of Americans support hydraulic fracturing. But remember, that's just for the subsets that know what those terms mean. And we also have questions about regulation. So perhaps not surprisingly, Texans are less likely to say that we need greater oversight and regulation of hydraulic fracturing. And folks in the general public of the U.S. is more likely to think that we need more oversight. All right, this one, I hope it's not too hard to read, but I tried to get a lot of information on this slide. This is just to give you a sense of the breadth of the kinds of questions we ask. We want to know who people trust. So on this particular question, it's who do you trust about information that they provide for you regarding the conservation of energy. This is for the U.S. as a whole. The most trusted group was academia and the science community. The least trusted group was the oil and gas companies. And you can kind of see where different groups fall in between. Now compare that with Texans. Texans, we had 60% most trusting of the academic and science community. And once again, the oil and gas companies didn't perform very well, but maybe a little more comfortable on some other things, and it's kind of confusing to compare them back and forth, so I put them together on this slide here. But it just gives you a sense of the areas maybe where we're in sync with the rest of the country, and maybe places that are a bit different. Like you can see retail stores. Texans are a lot more trusting of information on conservation of energy in retail stores than the United States as a whole. Same for electric providers and renewable energy companies and environmental groups. Maybe we're just more trusting people. I don't know. Climate change. Climate change is something this isn't a climate poll. Yale University does their own entire poll on climate change, but we do include a couple questions simply because this is an energy issue. And as it happens, whenever we have some new results on climate change, that's usually the first call I get from journalists. What does the new data say? The truth is, our numbers on climate haven't changed very much. Right now, 68% of Americans think, this is for the US, 68% of Americans think that climate change is occurring. It was interesting because when we started this poll, or we started asking this question in the spring of 2012. And for those folks who were here in Texas during the summer of 2012, do you remember how hot it was? It was ridiculous. It was pretty bad. But the percentage of Americans polled who said that climate change was occurring jumped in that 6 months from 68% to 73% by the fall. So there's a lot of literature coming out of academic journals looking at the relationship between weather and attitudes on climate change. And subsequently, there have been a number of different scientists at various universities across the country who have been very keen on using our data along with data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and to try to tweeze out what that relationship is. But last winter, we had that famous polar vortex, and the percentage of Americans who think that climate change is occurring went back down. We're right about where we started from when we initially asked this question. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves over time. And a little more of a look at some of this climate data, because here you see it's such a politicized issue. If you ever need a good example of one, we have the numbers here. 83% of Democrats in our last poll said that climate change is occurring. Less than half of Republicans said climate change is occurring. And you can see we also look at independents and libertarians as well. But strong political divide on that issue. And then here's just a look at Texas versus the United States. So Texans are just a little bit less likely to say that climate change is occurring as compared with the US at large. All right, I don't mean to throw some really complicated data graphic at you, but I hired a data visualization guy to work with our data in the last wave, and it's just kind of a fun way to see what our priorities are. Here, it's if you look on the x-axis, so at the bottom you can see this is broken down by age group, and we ask a question about where it's most and least important for the US government to spend your tax dollars. So if you see a green box, that's a priority of that age group. If you see a red box, that is something that's less important to that age group. And you see things are very different depending on which age group you fall into. So for the millennials, for those under 35, they're really thinking about job creation and education. And for older Americans, say looking at 65 and older, they're a lot more focused on Social Security and military and defense. I mean, some of that, intuitively makes sense. The younger folks are looking ahead. The older folks are thinking about, what their interests might be. But you can see with energy, it's kind of this ambiguous, bland color. We're not really sure what we think about energy a lot of the time. And if anything, it's considered less important. This used to be blue and red, and then I was concerned it looked too political, so now it looks a bit Christmassy. But it's similar kind of scale for people's political party affiliation, and we allow people not to just say whether they're Democratic or Republican, but if they're a strong Democrat, moderate Democrat, and then strong Republican, moderate Republican. And you can see, again, priorities are different. Like the Democrats are a lot more interested in military and defense as compared to Republicans. But again, across the board, just like last time, energy is just kind of opaque, pink. It's just not something that we're all that focused on. And another way to show you that is looking at this question specifically for Texas. So this is where Texans want their tax dollars spent. Almost a quarter say job creation is their top priority, not a surprise. Followed by Social Security at 20% and military and defense at 17%. But if you look all the way around toward the red color, energy is at 3%. This is an increase for us because when we started polling, energy actually ranked below our option for other. So it's not exactly a spending priority. And I think a big part of this, and of course, energy and these issues aren't mutually exclusive. They're all interconnected. But I think this gives us a sense that most people don't really understand what energy means. And another thing I didn't include in a slide, but I think is really worth pointing out, is when we ask people what they associate most with natural gas. It's job creation, which you can see is almost a quarter of Americans consider a spending priority. When we ask people what they associate most with renewable energy or renewable technologies, it's the environment. And you can see just 3% of Americans prioritize the environment for their tax spending. So that gives you a sense of maybe where our policy priorities might be headed. We'll just sort of have to see how things play out. We also consider things like whether people would be willing to pay more to protect the environment. So you can see that the more educated Americans are, the more likely, just a little bit, they are to say they're willing to pay a bit more to protect the environment, or pay much higher prices to protect the environment. Same question by age. Younger Americans are more willing to pay higher prices to protect the environment. And men are a little more willing than women to do so. And Democrats are a bit more likely than Republicans to say they'll do so, and libertarians are actually the highest on this. And of course, for Texas, Texans are a bit less willing to pay more to protect the environment. But it's interesting. So on this question and on a lot of questions, younger Americans are much more willing, or poll much more willing to pay more to protect the environment. They're also much more likely to say they're concerned about carbon emissions, much more likely to say much more likely to say they think that climate change is occurring, much more focused on kind of the environmental issues. But we don't know if that tells us a bit about where we're headed as a nation, or if as these people age up into the population, whether their priorities might shift as they're buying homes and starting families. So there's a lot of uncertainty with what these numbers mean over the coming decades, but it's certainly fun to track and interesting to sort of speculate on what we're seeing here. This is a question that's come up a lot lately in the news. Whether or not people agree with the statement, the U.S. should permit the export of natural gas to other countries. Obviously, with the fracking boom, it's changed the conversation in a big way. We've had international stories like what's been going on in Crimea, in Ukraine, and should the U.S. be a country that's a net export of natural gas? You can see here that the more educated someone is, the more likely they are to say, yes, we should be exporting natural gas to other countries. Younger Americans think that we should be, the younger Americans also are more likely to agree that the U.S. should be exporting natural gas to other countries. And men are a lot more likely to agree that we should be doing so. And those earning $50,000 or more, are more likely to say that we should be doing so by a significant amount. And here's what it looks like by party. What's kind of neat on this is there isn't a huge difference by party. I think that the differences are defined a lot more by age. I didn't include age in this. Did I include age in this? Sorry, I've been looking at a lot of slides. Okay, yeah. So younger Americans are much more likely to say we should permit the export of natural gas to other countries. Seniors, the oldest Americans, are much more likely to say, no, we should keep it here. And what I wonder about this, of course, we can't know exactly what's driving these trends, but older Americans are much more likely to remember the energy crisis and perhaps more likely to think we need to keep what we have here at home. And here is a look at Texas and the U.S. Again, they're pretty close. Just got a few more slides because I want to take questions if I can at the end. So do you think this is my last question. Do you think it's possible for the U.S. to become the world's leading producer of oil and gas? Who thinks yes? Raise your hand. Okay, who thinks no? Who thinks we already have been? You guys get it, okay. The poll isn't meant to be a pop quiz, but we do include a few questions each time just to get a sense of where people are on energy issues. We ask questions like, who do you think is our largest supplier of foreign oil? It's amazing to me how many people think it's Iraq, which it's not. We get most of our foreign oil from our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. So there's a couple things like that just to gauge where we are. And this was a question we included because this summer, when you consider oil and natural gas production, the U.S. became the leading producer of this. We just wanted to see if this was something on people's radars. You can see that Republicans were a bit more likely to say it's possible. But looking at Texas versus the U.S., Texans were a lot more likely to say we already have been. So go Texas, hook 'em. And with that, I'll just close. I have a few more minutes, so if you have any questions about the poll, I'd be happy to answer them.
Do you have comparisons from year to year, and has there been change in any of these issues, like climate change and fracking and all of that?
Absolutely, absolutely. So, I mean, it's the kind of thing where whenever I'm putting a talk together, it's what can I fit, and how interested do I think people will be in any given topic. And I tried to show you just like a lot of the different kinds of things that we're looking at. But we are developing, again, this data set. So this is just the example I have on who knows about fracking. And it hasn't changed significantly, but by the spring of 2013, in my talks, I was saying, more people are hearing about fracking. This is really interesting. Maybe we'll get to a point where more than half of Americans know what it is. You'd be surprised how many people think it's something from Battlestar Galactica. It's still pretty prevalent. But yeah, that is the goal, because we want to see how these attitudes shift over time and what might be responsible for them. And what's also been interesting is we report the results, but they get interpreted in the media in a variety of different ways. We've seen the same data described to two very different agendas based on what those outlets were. So we feel like we're at least trying to walk that line of falling somewhere in the middle and just giving the numbers out. And hydraulic fracturing is one of the areas that can be very contentious politically. So it's been interesting, to say the least, to see what's been done with those numbers.
Are there other universities that have polls similar to this, and do you look at that data and compare it?
That is a great question. We are the only regular, objective, nonpartisan poll on energy coming out of academia. So what we're doing here is very unique. It's still fairly new, but very unique. There are other university polls. I've compared our numbers, for example, on climate with a friend of mine, Tony Lazarowitz, runs the Yale University climate poll. On climate, our numbers are hand in hand. It's also interesting to consider how language is used in polling. The terms you use really influence the outcomes, so we try to be very careful that the questions we're asking are going after exactly what we want to learn and not influencing the way respondents choose their responses. Sometimes you'll see headlines that say, 85% of Americans want action on climate. And I'm not saying that's wrong. That was a headline from the New York Times a couple months ago. But the Yale folks and I kind of started discussing that, because if you ask people, do you want this, they might say yes or no. But then when you look a little closer, does that percentage actually think climate change is occurring based on poll numbers? That's a bigger question. So yeah, there are other polls. Our numbers seem to hold up very well with the ones coming out of academia, and we're pretty confident with our methodology.
Have you ever asked a question about the knowledge of how long fracking has been going on in oil production?
That's a great question. I've proposed doing that. We're at the point of recognizing that so few people even know what it is that we don't ask much beyond that. But you're absolutely right. It's been going on for decades, and
It'd make a great rhetorical question.
Yeah,
in terms of informing them. It's been going on since the early 50s.
That. Yeah, absolutely. It'd be.
Do you compare your polls to political polls that ask similar questions that are politically?
When they come up, I mean, we have a great guy who's he's, I don't know what his official title is, but he's sort of our news communications guy. So anytime there's a poll coming out of any agency, whether it's an industry-specific poll or what have you, it hits our radar, and we try to see where we are. On most of the big ones, we're very close. And some of it, like if you ask if people think climate change is occurring, you get a different response than if you ask if you think global warming is occurring. So we see some differences that we think are mostly because of language, but no, it's given us a sense that we've got a good strategy here.
What do you want the numbers of respondents your data set to get up to? Did you say you're what now? How many?
There really is no goal. I mean, we aim to get over 2,000 responses every 6 months. So we now have a gigantic, I don't even know if you call it a spreadsheet, but a gigantic sample size when you consider all the answers. But it varies mainly. I mean, the number shifts by a few hundred. As you saw, this last wave only had 2,105, and that was mainly because it's whenever we have enough people to accurately represent the American population.
You know what would be interesting is if y'all would couch a question on fracking to try and figure out what people really think it is, you know, to give them some options. I think it might be rather horrifying what they think it really is versus reality.
Yeah. Well, one thing that we do, it's a good point. With that question, are you familiar with the term? Because we want to do our subset, our subset based on whether people support or oppose fracking, and then we follow that with why. We try to get at what it is about fracking that they like or dislike. But before we get to those, we have a sort of test question in between, and it's what energy source do you associate hydraulic fracturing with? You'd be like, a lot of people are picking, I don't know, wind. So even if they say that they know what it means, it doesn't necessarily mean that they do.
Yes, can you tell me how many surveys do you have to mail out? I assume you mail them out.
Oh no, that's I should have said this earlier. Thank you
And
for bringing that up.
how many do you put out there to be able to get 2,500 back?
So it's actually done through an online panel. We find, and I guess sort of the accepted thought on this is that now that so few of us have landlines, online panels are actually quite effective. So we use a third party called Luna. They're like a Gallup. They're just the folks that we happen to be working with. We develop the poll, we develop the entire survey, and we do all the analyses. But they're working with a panel of millions. So they're the ones who are in charge of making sure it's representative. And each time we get to do like a test link to make sure we know how long it's going to take, and we try to keep it around 20 to 24 minutes. After that, people get bored and they just close the screen. But they're responsible for ensuring that is correct.
Do you sell this data?
We'd like this to be a long-term subscription model. So right now the poll is funded through discretionary funding from the dean as a priority of Maccombs and the university. It's extremely useful to a lot of different kinds of groups, but what we're finding is a lot of individual industry groups are doing their own polling, and almost everyone wants the data, but they expect that because we're a public institution, they should be able to access all the data. We make the top line results freely available, so if you go to our website, which I put up at on the last slide, if you go to our website, utenergypoll.com, which I passed. All right, well, it's utenergypoll.com. You go to our website, you click on the right sidebar, you can download the entire top line results for free and see what we've been up to. You have the results not just from the last poll, but you can look since 2011. So it's pretty interesting, and it's actually laid out in a way that's easy to digest, I think. It's not a whole bunch of numbers, and well, it's a bunch of numbers, but you know, they make sense. But yeah, we're in a place where we're trying to figure out the best way to share the information and whether we should maintain a subscriber model or how the best way to make this useful would be.
You mentioned earlier that there's a huge difference in people's response depending upon their conception of the definition of energy. Do you give a standard definition of energy when you start this poll?
No, we don't intentionally. We want to get a sense for where people are on any given issue. Certain questions, so we have a Keystone, as I said. In the next wave, we have several questions on Keystone. They're set up similar to the way that these fracking questions are set up, where first we want to get a sense of whether people have even heard of Keystone, whether or not, if they say they've heard of it, what it is, and then why they support or oppose it, with a bunch of different, choices that go with that. But later on, in a subsequent question, we do begin by explaining, the Keystone Pipeline is, expected to run and use the, we give a little bit more of the definition later. But the idea is to sort of get a sense of where they are without doing the explaining for them.
Another question. What portion of the survey do you try to keep constant, same questions, survey after survey after survey, and what portion do you keep snapshot current events?
It's a good question, because we've been kind of figuring that out as we go. It's always at least 80% the same, Some questions rotate annually rather than biannually. We have a lot of questions on consumer behavior, for example. How likely in the next 5 years are you to own a hybrid vehicle, or change your light bulbs, or think about insulation in your house? Questions like that. We might not ask every time, but we want to get once a year. Some questions started as a special section, like a lot of our fracking questions. Fracking was a special section itself in the second wave of the poll, and there was so much media interest in what we were doing. We included that in subsequent polls, and it's been some of our best coverage on fracking stuff. So it really varies. And some questions we anticipated keeping in, and then just we didn't really learn anything from them. They were hard to interpret results, and so we dropped them.
Have you ever used the word utility cost instead of energy?
We have had a couple questions on utility costs, more in individual polls. I'd probably go back and dig that up if you're interested. A lot of people don't even know what their utility is. So I'm repeatedly surprised. I shouldn't be at this point. But yeah, we've had a couple questions, I think around the third or fourth iteration of the poll, thinking on utilities and seeing how people respond to that. Well, thank you so much for having me here. It's been a treat. Thank you.